Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this test case presentation entitled Pediatric Clinical and Health Services Outcomes Following Tympanostomy Tube Insertion. My name is Keondae Ervin, and I'm the Senior Project Manager of Research at the NEST Coordinating Center, and I will be moderating this session. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the following panel participants for this session. For the presenters, we have Dr. Chris Forrest, who is the Director of PEDSnet and a Professor of Pediatrics at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Keith Jansen, who is the President and CEO of AventaMed, and we have Dr. Eric Mann, who is the Chief Medical Officer within the OHT1 OPEQ CDRH division of the FDA. And we also have joining for the Q&A session, Dr. Kevin Haynes, who is an Associate Director of Epidemiology at Jansen, previously HealthCore, Dr. Nilsa Loyo-Berrios, who is the Deputy Director, Division of Clinical Science and Quality in the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, CDRH, within the FDA, and Dr. Srinivas, who is the Director, Division of Dental and ENT Devices within the OHT1 OPEQ CDRH division of the FDA. Next slide. This study had a project duration of roughly 12 months and sought to explore health services and clinical outcomes in children who are eligible for a tympanostomy tube insertion procedure, and contrast children who undergo the procedure versus those who do not. This epidemiological study evaluates otitis media and its complications, surgical interventions, and the clinical outcomes of tympanostomy tube insertion in the disease area of otolaryngology. This test case uses electronic health records and claims data to evaluate these outcomes. The evidence generated from the study can inform the clinical community, such as pediatricians, ENT surgeons, and can even address guidelines for treatment. Next slide. One of the most important set of criteria for selection of this study is that there have been no real-world evidence studies of this magnitude that are comprehensive in nature that use descriptive and comparative analyses to evaluate clinical and health services outcomes for tympanostomy tube insertion. This study also proves to generate evidence that may deem useful in creating new medical devices or novel approaches in the treatment of otitis media. This test case has an inherent value to the medical device ecosystem and NEST by providing important and quality evidence in this disease area. To date, this would be the largest study conducted in tympanostomy tubes, which would provide an in-depth evaluation of clinical and procedural outcomes. Because tympanostomy tube insertion is one of the most common pediatric surgeries, it is critical for this type of study to exist. Not only can this study inform pediatricians, primary care physicians, ENT surgeons, policymakers, and health system leaders, but it is also of great interest to patients and their families who can benefit from these important findings to manage real-world issues associated with ear infections. The role of NEST in this study was comprised of seamless communication with the project team and various stakeholders to ensure administrative requirements were managed efficiently and in real time. There was also a necessity to provide timely and clear guidance, as well as feedback when necessary throughout the life cycle of the project to ensure alignment of project goals and objectives, including engagement with the FDA. And now I'd like to hand it off to Keith Jansen.
Thank you, Keondae. My name is Keith Jansen. I'm President and CEO of AventaMed. We're an Irish-based company, although I'm based here in the United States. Next slide, please. So the technology of interest is the Solo Plus tympanostomy tube system. And as Keondae had referenced before, why are we looking at tympanostomy tubes? Well, first and foremost, it is absolutely the most frequently performed pediatric surgery in the world. Well over 1 million of these procedures are done in the United States. When you look at the manner in which they're performed and where, in younger children, say kids younger than 8, 9 years old, they're typically done in an OR setting under general anesthesia. And really, our product goal was to deliver excellent outcomes without having to use the general anesthesia in an office setting and at a much lower cost. And some of the challenges associated with the current methods of tympanostomy tube placement are, of course, the risks associated with general anesthesia, the pre-op preparation, including patients having to be without food and water for 6 hours prior to the procedure, the overall recovery period, including emergence delirium when children are coming out from their general anesthesia, the overall high costs associated with the procedure. These tubes are very, very small and they're very inexpensive, but it's the really the cost, the overall cost, which is in the thousands and thousands of dollars between OR time, anesthesia time, recovery time, et cetera, that are quite costly. These procedures are time intensive, not only for the patients, but their families and healthcare professionals. And in this day of COVID, I think it's safe to say that there are a number of patients and their families who would rather not go to a hospital if they don't have to. So typically the steps of the procedure are utilizing the anesthesia, general anesthesia, putting in a small instrument called a speculum into the ear, then creating a laryngotomy with a small instrument, incision device, then placing the tympanostomy tube with an alligator forceps, and then tapping it in position. Next slide, please. Going forward, our supposition and our assessment is that it can be done in an office very, very safely under topical anesthesia. So those challenges associated with how they're performed today go away. And on the right, you can see we've gone from 5 steps to 3 steps where we've got a self-contained system. Yes, there has to be an anesthesia. Yes, there has to be a speculum, but the tube and the laryngotomy knife, et cetera, are all contained into a single device. Next slide, please. So what are and what were the objectives and why NEST in this test case? Well, really, we want to gather clinical and economic outcomes related to the gold standard of tympanostomy tubes, ultimately to gain a much deeper understanding of the potential benefits to the patients, the healthcare providers, and the payers. By being able to collect so many patients and such a large group of patients in real world data, it's a absolutely huge data source. And Dr. Forrest will speak to that here in a little while, that no other paper, no other study has been, can even come close to. Ultimately, we want to better understand the clinical outcomes, including any broad scale complications, and then stratifying it by any potentially contributing factors. We can then, I believe, utilize the data to set comparative benchmarks for clinical trial study designs and ultimate FDA approvals. And then lastly, use the information to establish an overall value proposition for products and procedures like this. So I will now like to hand it off to Dr. Chris Forrest, and he can tell you details about the protocol and the study itself.
Well, thanks, Keith. It's a real pleasure to be presenting to you from Philadelphia. I am Chris Forrest. I'm a professor of pediatrics here at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. But actually more relevant to this talk, I'm the director and founder of PEDSnet, which is a national pediatric clinical research network that is dedicated to advancing our knowledge on how to care for children. And this project fits squarely within our mission. It was a real delight to conduct with a pretty diverse team. And I think I just wanted to highlight the diversity of the team because that's part of what made this project special. Keith and his colleagues from AventaMed participated in every step of the project, helped us design the project, interpret the results, and will help us with the public dissemination. And having Keith and his team from AventaMed helping us, working with us side by side was really useful in terms of grounding the study to something that would be useful for future decision makers. We also included Keondae every step of the way, and it did help us tremendously to have him a member of the team, not just administratively, but also scientifically, making sure that we were staying on track with the needs of NEST. And in terms of the PEDSnet team, we were able to rapidly assemble several pediatric otolaryngologists who were very excited about this project. We included informaticians and data scientists who understand the real world data deeply, understand its quality, its strengths, and its limitations, statisticians to model the data, and outcomes researchers. So it was a number of skill sets brought to the table in order to conduct this research. So let's go to the next slide. You know, I'm a pediatrician, I'm a general pediatrician, and otitis media in pediatrics is considered bread and butter. It's 10% of all primary care visits to general pediatricians and family physicians. In a study that we did a few years ago now, we found that referrals to subspecialists from pediatricians, right? So that referral process was dominated by otitis media. 1 in 10 referrals made to subspecialists, any subspecialist, was for evaluation of serous chronic otitis media and the possibility for myringotomy and tympanostomy tube insertion. So it's a profoundly common problem. And in fact, tympanostomy tube insertion that Keith so nicely described is a very common ambulatory procedure. Some of the data that we've seen across pediatric institutions suggests that it accounts for as much as 15% of ambulatory surgical revenue, which is pretty astounding. So despite how common otitis media is seen in clinical care, despite how common it is as a surgical procedure, we actually had remarkably little information on its epidemiology across large populations, as well as the outcomes of tympanostomy tubes. It's sort of one of these problems where it's so common, people take for granted that we know the answers to the questions that we're going to be addressing today, but in fact we don't. And so one of the beauties of today's talk is that we're actually presenting novel data on one of the most common problems in pediatrics. Let's go to the next slide. So our overall purpose was to use real-world data to describe and evaluate population rates of otitis media, its surgical management, that is tympanostomy tube insertion, as well as I want to say TTI as an abbreviation for tympanostomy tube insertion, as well as the ancillary procedures associated with TTI, and then the outcomes associated with TTI insertion. So that would be clinical outcomes as well as health services outcomes. When I say real-world data, I'm actually referring to two types of data sources. Today, I'll focus on one, electronic health record data. We're in the process of finalizing work with HealthCore to replicate much of what we've done with electronic health record data using health plan data. They provide two different windows into the same problem, and we're very excited about triangulating our understanding of tympanostomy tube insertion with both data sources. But today, focusing on EHR data. Next slide, please. This project was conducted by PEDSnet. And as I said in the beginning, PEDSnet is a clinical research network that's national in scope. Here on the map, I'm showing the various hospitals. They're really open pediatric integrated delivery systems because we call them hospitals, but they all have primary care practices affiliated with them, outpatient specialty clinics, outpatient specialty care centers, as well as inpatient facilities. But you can see on the map where they're located. Over in Pennsylvania and Delaware, you have Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where I work, as well as DuPont Children's, which is part of the Nemours Health System. Florida, also part of the Nemours Health System, Orlando Children's Hospital. In Ohio, Nationwide Children's in the middle of the state in Columbus, as well as Cincinnati Children's in the southwest portion of the state. In the Midwest, St. Louis Children's Hospital, Colorado Children's Hospital in the Mountain States, then over on the West Coast, Seattle Children's Hospital. And this was the snapshot of the institutions that participated in PEDSnet at the time that we did the study. But PEDSnet is actually expanding to several other institutions as we speak. The map also shows you where all the patients come from. PEDSnet currently has a database that was used in this study of about 6.8 million children. The data go back as far as 2009, and they end in terms of the data we use for the study about mid to late 2020. The heat map shows you where the patients come from. So a darker color means more patients. So in fact, most of the patients come from the primary market areas surrounding the health systems, but we actually have patients from all over the country in the PEDSnet database, from all major metropolitan areas in all 50 states, which just reflects the notion that these large pediatric academic medical centers are major referral centers for the country. And then finally, it's important to bear in mind how the data are accrued. Each institution has its own electronic health record system. Data are entered by clinicians, in some cases patients, through the patient portal. It's stored in the local database, and then our PEDSnet teams at each institution extract those data, transform them to common standards, what we call a common data model. We use the OMOP common data model, and then submit those data to the data coordinating center that I lead here at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So the data are actually centralized in Philadelphia, and we have a regulatory environment and a human subjects environment and a privacy environment that enables that kind of sharing. We have appropriate agreements, and actually our regulatory groups work together in order to come up with common regulatory agreements. So we don't have 8 different data use agreements. We have one come up with common IRB procedures so we don't have multiple IRBs. We operate under a single IRB, et cetera. So that idea of extracting data, transforming it to a common data model makes the data analysis ready. It's updated every 3 months. Once in the data coordinating center, 1,000 different data quality checks are done to ensure that the data conform to the data model standards. So a lot of work goes into getting the data to the point where we can analyze it. Next slide, please. So I wanted to walk you through some of the data quality work that we did for this project. All of the data were run through those 1,000 data characterization checks. But then when we do a specific study, we evaluate the data's fitness for the purpose to which it is being evaluated, right? So it's study-specific data quality assessment. One of the most important kinds of analyses that we do is a focus on the formation of the study cohort. So we call that an attrition table. Each step over on the left side of the slide is one step in the formation of the study cohort. And you can see we started with 6.4 million children, and we got to 4.8 million children after we excluded kids who didn't have a face-to-face physician visit. Maybe they just had they came to one of our institutions for an x-ray or for a lab test. We also required at least 45 days of observation without otitis media so that they could enter the cohort free of otitis media and we could look at incidence rates. So we started with 4.84 million kids, less than 18, with an adequate observation period. It's about 3/4 of our overall sample. And this was the sample that we used for the otitis media epidemiology studies. I'm not going to show that. I'm going to focus on the tympanostomy tube insertion stuff today, but we replicated these attrition steps at each institution and something remarkable emerged. Next slide. It didn't look the same across each institution, all right? So let me walk you through the slide. On the y-axis is the percent of each institution's population that entered the study cohort. And on the x-axis is time. We computed these proportions for each month across the greater than decade study period. And what you would expect after 2009, you see a lot of jumping around because that's the beginning of when we actually brought the data into our database. What you'd expect is that these lines, each one representing one institution, would hover around 0.1%. And we see the blue line, one institution above 0.1%, and the pink line, another institution below. And in further analysis, we actually learned that there were gaps in the data that enabled us, that we would require for study cohort formation, that precluded the incorporation of those two institutions. So they ultimately were excluded from the analysis, which actually wasn't problematic because the database is so huge, we can exclude years or we could exclude institutions if needed. Also note in the beginning of 2020, that sharp decline, which was associated with the beginning of the COVID pandemic. We also conduct a number of what you might call external validation tests. These are tests that evaluate whether the data is behaving as we would expect based on clinical knowledge or even knowledge from the literature. So we expected seasonal variation in the rates of otitis media, and we saw that. First slide on the left, time on the x-axis. On the y-axis is the percentage of kids, or the number of kids per thousand, I should say, who experience an otitis media episode. And you see this really nice sawtooth pattern. The peaks are in the winter when we know otitis media was more common. And that was reassuring because we're picking up an expected signal based on a variety of studies that have shown these seasonal patterns for otitis media. We also expected a marked decline associated with the beginning of the pandemic, and that's on the right side. And what you're seeing is the rates of otitis media just for 2020, severe drop in March and April when kids were essentially in lockdown with their families, with a gradual rise as health systems started to develop processes and procedures to get kids back into the systems. Next slide, please. And finally, we looked at tympanostomy tube insertion rates, incidence rates on the left side, prevalence rates on the right side. We had an intuition that tympanostomy tube insertion rates by themselves should be declining because there's been attention to inappropriate use of tympanostomy tubes. There have been guidelines that have emerged. And there's been a sort of a trend in ENT surgery to sort of tighten up who we do surgeries on. And what you see is in fact, you see that decline. You see decline in rates in the red lines of tympanostomy tube insertion. But you see kind of a flat line for kids who had tympanostomy tubes inserted plus adenoidectomy, which is a common ancillary procedure. And that is probably because those kids are a little bit different. They've got more going on and they're less discretionary in terms of the need for their procedure. Let's go on to the next slide. And finally, there was a sense among our ENT team that the rates of tonsillectomy should be decreasing. Tonsillectomy isn't really used to treat otitis media, but it's often done in conjunction with tympanostomy tube insertion. And lo and behold, we sort of saw a flat, you can kind of imagine a flat line for adenoidectomy, and we saw declining rates of tonsillectomy. So all of these slides are meant to show you that we spent a lot of time, maybe half of our time, simply evaluating the data quality, understanding what part of the database might be excluded, what part should be included, and then evaluating the data in terms of its external validity to ensure that we can pick up known signals. And in fact, we were able to, which gives us much greater confidence in the benchmarking that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So the bulk of what I'll present today in terms of specific quantitative results relates to these outcomes. We were interested in understanding how common, sort of benchmarking a large database, are clinical outcomes following tympanostomy tube insertion. Things like otitis media episodes, the need for a second surgery, various kinds of complications and comorbidities. How often are kids using additional services? Primary care for ear care, ENT for otitis media care, emergency department and hospitalization, as well as the use of antibiotics. We were not able to directly compute costs because charge data for healthcare institutions as well as for health plans is very sensitive information. So instead, what we did is we computed a standardized resource use index measure, which is essentially assigning a single dollar amount to every primary care visit, regardless of where it occurred. So we standardized the charges according to the national Medicare fee schedule. Next slide. So here are some of the benchmarking that I mentioned. These are averages that are pretty solid. By that, I mean they are they're drawn from 75,000 children who had tympanostomy tubes inserted. That was the ultimate number of kids in our data who we based these computations on. So 5% in the year following their first TTI, 5% had a second, 15% used the emergency department, about 2 and 3 had additional outpatient visits, 1 in 3 had 3 or more outpatient visits, 2% were hospitalized, and during that hospitalization, they had a diagnosis of otitis media recorded, and our resource use index was about $1,400. So somewhere in that ballpark was the average cost associated with future utilization for our study sample. But perhaps just as importantly is that last column, which is the range across our institutions. These are not monolithic averages. So just take, for example, ED use for otitis media. One of the institutions recorded just 9% of their patients using the emergency department subsequently, and another 27%, a threefold level of variation. So these outcomes have tremendous geographic and institutional variation, which is something that needs to be kept in mind when interpreting them. Next slide. This is a finding that was very exciting for our ENT surgeons, and we believe it's going to change the way in which surgeons approach the treatment of tympanostomy tube and the use of adenoidectomy, and we're exploring it much more deeply. The guidelines for tympanostomy tube insertion suggest that children less than age 4 should not have adenoidectomy performed. But in fact, some of the kids do have adenoidectomy performed. Not all guidelines are followed indiscriminately. And what this slide is showing is that actually the risk of future surgeries depends in part on whether or not you had an adenoidectomy. The red lines here are kids who did not have an adenoidectomy, and the gray lines are kids who did. The x-axis is time, and the y-axis is the cumulative percentage of kids who received a second surgery. So you can see a pretty big difference in those lines. And what that suggests in terms of, say, a hazard ratio down there in the lower right, is that the use of adenoidectomy, certainly in some kids, actually protects them against the need for a second surgery, even in younger age groups where guidelines suggest that adenoidectomy is not needed. Next slide. We also were able, with such a large data set, to look at rare complications. There's virtually no information on how commonly these complications like lateral sinus thrombosis or mastoiditis occur following tympanostomy tubes. And so what we did is we computed these clinical outcomes per 1,000 patient years. For diagnosis like speech and language delay, we required that the child did not have that before their diagnosis, and we were able to produce fairly tight confidence intervals so that there are now benchmarking data for complications and comorbidities associated with T-tubes in the year following the surgery. Next slide. So there are a few key lessons I wanted to touch on as I bring this to closure. I was only able to give you an advertisement of the study. There's a lot more that is forthcoming, but I think you got a sense of that data quality was key to us. So that's the third point here. Study-specific data quality assessment is absolutely essential and a necessary first step in real-world data studies. And in fact, we just received a grant in PEDSnet to start to develop standards by which study-specific data quality should be reported in the literature, so that we have a good way of understanding, just like we understand who's in a cohort, we should understand how real-world data are evaluated for their data quality. Our institutions currently do not collect universal device identifiers, so we are unable to do a comparative analysis of different types of tympanostomy tubes. I think that's changing. We have a few studies right now ongoing that are looking at some of the implementation issues around incorporating UDI in the electronic health record, but the value proposition still needs to be made for health systems in order to start rolling out UDIs widely across the entire organization. We learned, as I mentioned before, that cost and charge data are very sensitive, and so we'll probably need, as we go forward, to develop even better standardized resource use indices, much even more detailed than what we did for this study. And importantly, these large databases, such as the PEDSnet database, allows for detection of rare events like lateral sinus thrombosis with the estimation of confidence intervals that are fairly tight. And importantly, it also allows us to find new things out about problems like otitis media and tympanostomy tube insertion, such as the relative benefit of adding adenoidectomy. Who is it most beneficial for? We're going to try to discover that. You know, what about those under 4 kids? Who was actually getting the tympanostomy tubes? Did they have other comorbidities? We're going to understand that as we go forward with this line of work. So in the final slide, next slide, please. Just wanted to show you that we believe this 1-year study, and this is unusual for a 1-year study, has 4 dissemination products. We're going to be comprehensively describing otitis media and its medical treatments, as well as tympanostomy tube insertion and its ancillary treatments. But then we'll also start to look at who experiences each of these outcomes, the clinical outcomes and the health services outcomes. We'll put the health services and clinical outcome benchmarks out in the literature, but we'll model who's more or less likely to experience them. And then finally, we're going to do a deeper dive on adenoidectomy and do a comparative study on tympanostomy tube insertion only, adenoidectomy only. There are some kids who only get that, and then both. So thanks very much for your attention. And now I'd like to turn pass the baton to Dr. Eric Mann at the FDA.
Good afternoon. I am Eric Mann. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for the Office of Health Technology 1 in CDRH. And it is my pleasure to present a very brief presentation and perspective on real-world evidence and how it may apply to regulatory requirements for tympanostomy tubes and to this NEST test case. Next slide, please. So FDA is committed to fostering the use of real-world evidence to demonstrate compliance with various regulatory requirements and to support regulatory decision-making as outlined in our 2017 guidance. Some examples of ways that RWE might be used for regulatory purposes might include to help design clinical studies through hypothesis generation, or perhaps through informing the design of a clinical trial, or even as a platform to support the conduct of a trial. It could also be used for evidence generation for things such as post-approval studies, adverse event monitoring, or even expanding a device's indications for use under certain circumstances. However, when we are using real-world evidence for any of these various applications, it should be both reliable and relevant when taking into account the proposed regulatory context of use. Next slide, please. To expand on these 2 points a little further, the reliability should be ensured by certain data accrual characteristics, such as pre-specification of a study protocol, the methodology for data capture, and patient selection methods. And of course, there should be privacy and patient protections in place. And data quality control is also essential to ensure real-world evidence reliability. And there should be processes in place during data collection and analysis that minimize errors and ensure data integrity. Also, in general, the relevance of the real-world evidence for any particular regulatory purpose should be demonstrated by showing that the variables, endpoints, assessments, and study population being proposed are both applicable and appropriate to address the regulatory requirement or issue under consideration. Next slide. Now, turning to how real-world evidence might have regulatory applications specifically for tympanostomy tubes, I'd like to give a brief background on how we are currently regulating these devices. FDA, as you may know, uses a risk-based classification system to determine the regulatory requirements for each device type. And tympanostomy tubes are placed into what we call class 2 or the moderate risk category. They are also happen to be what we call pre-amendments devices, meaning that they were on the market prior to the medical device amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1976. And thus we have a very long history with these devices. We understand the parameters that are needed to ensure their safety and effectiveness. The typical indications for use statement that we've cleared for these devices is a general one regarding ventilation and drainage of the middle ear. As a class 2 device, a new tympanostomy tube would need to be cleared through a marketing application called a 510K. And in this marketing application, the sponsor must show that the new device is what we term substantially equivalent to another legally marketed tympanostomy tube. And we do this primarily on the basis of comparing the indications for use, the design, the materials, and other preclinical testing, and compare that to the predicate device. Of note, clinical data are typically not required to demonstrate substantial equivalence for a new tympanostomy tube, unless the new device has a significant change in technology compared to the predicate device, as for example, with a drug device combination product or a tympanostomy tube insertion device being used in an office setting, similar to what Keith was describing earlier. Next slide, please. So given that clinical data is usually not required to support the pre-market application for these devices, real-world data and real-world evidence really provide a special opportunity to gather information on how these various tubes are performing after marketing clearance. And although the present NEST study on tympanostomy tubes and Otodes media with effusion is not designed or intended for regulatory purposes, it may nonetheless provide very useful information for epidemiological and clinical guideline development purposes. But to be of use for a regulatory purpose, the real-world data will really need to be associated with a specific device as identified by the manufacturer and model, and perhaps hopefully someday through the UDI, although we do note the difficulties with that in electronic health records at present. Once we do have this device-specific real-world data, it is then possible to develop real-world evidence for things like characterization of adverse events, or for supporting marketing claims regarding parameters of interest, such as duration of intubation, incidence of postoperative otorrhea, or early tube occlusion. And as I alluded to previously, it may also have applications in the pre-market sphere for hypothesis generation, for developing control arms for studies, or in some cases for supporting pre-market applications, such as expansion of the indications for use. So in summary, FDA recognizes the very important role that RWE can play in helping meet the regulatory requirements for a very broad range of devices, including tympanostomy tubes. Next slide. Thank you, and we look forward to the opportunity to discuss questions from the audience.